Hello everybody, my name is Walter and this is episode 54 of my Redstone Commands Series. In this episode I will cover what is likely the most versatile but also most complex command in the game, the execute command. Now one thing of note here is that this command was more or less changed with every update since it was introduced in the game, and subsequently think of this more as an introduction into the command and what it can currently do. If you want to know the latest infos and the absolute details of all of the options you have with this command, I would really recommend having a look at the Wikipedia article, which is also linked in the description. But with that said, let's get started. Now, the primary function of the execute command is to manipulate how another command is being executed. It can do this in three different ways. It can add modifiers to the executor and the execution position. It can add conditions that need to be fulfilled for the command to be actually executed. And it can store the return values of the executed command in NBT data storage and similar. Now, the basic syntax for this command deviates quite a bit from other commands insofar that only the very start and the very end are somewhat fixed. The command always starts with the name of the command execute, and it always, or in most cases at least, stops with the run subcommand followed by the actually to be manipulated command. So far, so good. Now, in between the two, you can have as many or as few modifiers, conditions, and stores as you need. They can be chained, repeated, and ordered as you require for whatever situation you want to use this command, and are always passed from left to right. So you can, for example, first change who is executing the command, then you check a certain condition, and then you can, for example, manipulate where the command is executed, and so on. Now, let's quickly talk about a few more details here. First of all, modifiers, as I already said, modify who executes the command and where the command is executed. Not only the position, but also the rotation and dimension. If you address multiple executors or multiple positions, then this command will lead to forking. Forking means everything that comes after this part where you fork gets basically done once for every entity or every position you have addressed. This can be quite useful if you want to get around limitations for certain commands like the data command, which can generally only address a single entity, but by using this execute command here, you can get around this limitation. Conditions need to be fulfilled for everything that follows to be actually be executed. A little special case here is that you can actually use a condition as the last part of the command. So you don't need an actual run subcommand. You can also finish with a condition. If that is the case, then the return value of the condition, so did it succeed or did it not succeed, 0 or 1, that is returned as the return value of the execute command essentially, and can be, for example, stored later on. And then the store value or the store subcommands can be used to set the return values into a scoreboard score, into an NBT data, or a boss bar even. Now in the following, I'll go through the different subcommands, starting with modifying who is executing the command. So let's start with the likely most used option, which is the as, and followed by target or targets, which can be a player name, a unique identifier, a target selector, or similar. If you are addressing multiple entities with that, the command will fork. This is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Slightly more interesting, but more edge case is the on modifier, which goes over a relationship. So here you can use it to, for example, address who shot a certain projectile or who is riding a certain vehicle or similar. So let's quickly go through the options. Attacker is whoever damaged the executor within the last 5 seconds. Then we have controller, who is riding and controlling the executor. So for example, a boat or a minecart. Then we have whoever is holding the leash, or who generated a projectile, a prime TNT, or another entity. The owner of a tamed animal, or whoever is riding currently on the executor. So this, since you can have multiple passengers occasionally, can lead to forking again. Then who is currently being targeted, not directly attacked, but targeted by the current executor. And also who is currently being ridden by the executor. So as I said, this goes over the relationship. Now, a somewhat special case here is summon, and then you need to specify an entity. This will, similarly to the summon command, create an entity of the given type. You can only really specify the type, not really NBT data here. And that entity that was just created is now the new executor. This can be quite useful if you want to create a specific entity somewhere and you want that entity to do something. For example, trigger a function. And with this subcommand, you can do all of this in just one command. Next up, we have modifying the execution position directly. The most commonly used option here is add, and then you specify again one or multiple entities as the target or targets. This is similar to what you did with the as command or subcommand, but instead of changing who's executing the command, you change the dimension, the position, and also rotation to the same as the target or targets. If you're addressing multiple targets, this will again fork. The next option is align, and then you specify the axis. Now aligning allows you to get the block positions basically, which means that you round downwards, basically floor, for the specified axis. To specify an axis, you write X, Y, or Z, or a combination of the three. The order doesn't matter, but you mustn't repeat any of the letters. We'll see an example a bit later. Anchored means whether you are addressing the eye level or the feet level of the entities or positions you are currently addressing. The default usually is you're addressing the feet, which is basically the 0 position of an entity essentially. In allows you to manipulate what dimension we're talking about. Are we talking about the overworld, the nether, or the end? This can be quite useful if you want to teleport directly from the overworld into the nether, for example. Interesting enough, it also scales the position. So if you're going from the overworld into the nether, it will divide the position by 8. If you go in the opposite direction, it will multiply by 8. Next up, we have modifying the position slightly less directly, starting with position. Now, position changes only the execution position. You can give it direct coordinates, either absolute or relative, which can be used, for example, to fine-tune your position, maybe a step to the right or upwards or similar. But you can also use as target or targets, which is similar to just the as option, but will only change the position, not the rotation. It will also, if you address multiple targets, again, fork. Also rather interesting, you can use over and then a so-called height map, which can be world surface, motion blocking no leaves, or ocean floor, which all basically mean one thing: the highest block in the world at the X and Z coordinates you're currently talking about. There are some minute deviations. If you're interested in more details, I'll put a link in the description. Similar to position, you can also use rotated to change the rotation. You can either give it the direct yaw and pitch numbers or values, or you can use also as target or targets. Again, this will fork, and it will also, again, only manipulate this time the execution rotation, not the position. Also, sometimes quite useful is facing, which means that you are not directly giving the angles, but you're giving a target point to look at. This can be just a triplet of coordinates, relative or absolute, or you can use entity and then specify one or multiple entities again, player name, target name, unique identifier, target selector, or similar. And then you have to specify whether you want to look at the eyes of the entity or the feet of the entity. So this can be quite useful if you want the player to look at the big bad guy who just appeared in your world or similar. And that were the modifiers, so let's continue with the conditions. Now, all of the conditions always start either with an if or an unless. If means that only if the condition is fulfilled, the command continues. Unless is the opposite, only if the condition is not fulfilled, the command continues. Now, first of all, let's start with conditions that have to do with coordinates. The first is checking for a block in a certain position. You start with block, then you define the position you want to check. which is either absolute coordinates, x, y, z, or relative coordinates. And then you specify what block you're looking for. This can include block data and NBT data, if available for the specific block type you're looking at. You can also compare two whole areas. So if you start with blocks and then define an area through two opposing corners, which are the start and the end corner, again, absolute or relative coordinate triplets. Then you define the lower northeast corner of the destination area. You only need to define one corner because it automatically already knows how big the area must be you want to compare. And then you continue with either all or masked. All means that you're comparing all blocks, including air blocks. Masked means that you are only comparing everything that is not an air block. This can be quite useful if you, for example, have some kind of riddle and you want the player to complete a statue or something in a specific pattern. And that way you can check whether the pattern as a whole is correctly placed without having to do this for each block individually. Biome allows you to check whether the current position or the position you are addressing here is part of a given biome. Similarly, you can check whether you are currently in a specific dimension with the command execution. And you can also check whether a certain coordinate is currently loaded. So whether block ticking and similar are currently running on this part. The next few checks have to do with internal values of entities for the most part, or block entities. Again, we start with if or unless, and then you can, for example, check whether you actually have a specific entity. What this means is that you continue with entity, and then you specify, for example, a unique identifier, a player name, or a target selector. And only if it can find an entity that fits those criteria, the command will continue. It will not fork, but if this is, for example, used as the last part of the command, so you don't have a run command, but this condition, then the return value is actually how many entities it found that fulfilled those conditions. You will see an example a bit later. So this can be quite useful if you want to check whether, for example, a certain player is currently in the game or something like that. You can also check directly the NBT data, or like it's nowadays called the structured components. So you continue with, or you write data, and then depending on what you're looking at, you have either block followed by the coordinates of the block, relative or absolute. You have entity and then the target selector, or however you want to address that entity, or storage and then the storage source. So what storage are you talking about? And following that, you can define further the path within the NBT data. So do you want to have only let's say the custom name, or do you want to have a look at what is in the left hand of the player or something like that? Items is specifically when you're talking about the inventory of a block or an entity. Block again via the coordinates, entity again via player name, unique identifier, target selector. After that, you can define what slot we are talking about, or even multiple slots, and then what item you are searching for. So this can be quite useful if you want to check whether a player has a certain item in their inventory, or maybe in the main hand, or like something like that. And only if that is the case, so if they hold the magical key, the door will open or something. Next up, we have conditions that check for values that are not really part of the entities themselves. As usual, we start with if or unless, and then the first option would be checking a scoreboard objective. So you continue with score, then you specify the target and the objective you want to check. And then you have two options. The first is checking whether the current score for this target and objective is in a given range. Ranges are usually given at, for example, 0.10. This would be inclusive 0 to 10. Or second option is comparing it to another score. So you can check whether it's smaller, smaller equal, greater equal, or greater than the objective of another entity, or even the same entity and a different objective and similar. Source is again a target or an entity, and the objective is the objective. So you can also use the option function followed by the name of a function. Now this is rather interesting. With the introduction of the return command, it's able to control the return values of a function when it is executed. And only if the function that is named here has a return command inside of it, and that return command is executed, only then will this whole system here continue, also only if the function executes successfully. So that's rather interesting, especially because this also allows you to do other stuff in the meantime while the execute command is still running. Because at this point, the entire function is executed, and yeah, as I said, this allows you to do a lot of things in the background without having to stop the execute command itself. Predicate allows you to run a predicate, which can be part of data packs, and check whether the predicate itself is successful or not. And that were all of the conditions. Now let's quickly talk about the store subcommands. So those always start with store and then either result or success. Result is something like, for example, when you fill an area, how many blocks were placed. Success is just it was successful or it was not successful. After that, you have a couple options. The first is storing the return value or the value you get from the executed command itself or the condition that was executed at the very end, either in the NBT data of a block, an entity, or a storage. Block defined by its coordinates, entity defined by player name, unique identifier, target selector, and storage by its name, basically. After that, you further define the path within the NBT data. Then you define what type of value we're talking about. Is it a byte, a short? Is it an integer? Is it a float? Or is it a double precision float number? A floating point number. And then you can even scale the value a bit more. So you can multiply it with 6 for whatever reason. I will show you an example a bit later. Then you can also write the value directly into a scoreboard objective or into a score. So you continue with score, then you specify one or multiple entities, and then the objective you want to override with this value. And the final option is to put it into a boss bar. So you continue with the boss bar, then the name of the boss bar, and then you define whether you want to write the value into the current value of the boss bar, or if you want to change the maximum value of the boss bar. And that were all of the currently available subcommands. So let me show you just a few examples so you can get a basic idea of what you can actually do with this command. So I'm going to start with playing around with the executor. For that, I prepared 2 chickens here. The one at the bottom is nothing special, except it's the vehicle for Chick Norris, which also has a special tag. So I can address Chick Norris, but not the chicken below, at least not directly. So let's have a look. I'm using execute as, and then I'm addressing a chicken within 10 meters that has the Chick Norris tag, which is unique. But I actually want to address the chicken below, which I can do in this case due to it being the vehicle. So I continue with on vehicle, and now the execute of the command is the chicken at the bottom. And then I'm running a command to have them give themselves the glowing effect for 1 second. And that is how you can use relationships and the as subcommand. The next example I'm going to run in a repeat command block, and this is playing around with positions. So let's quickly go through this. So first I'm going to execute as all players. So at this point, if there were multiple players in this world, it would fork. Then the new executor is each player for each fork. I'm running at self. So I'm changing position, rotation, dimension to the player. Then I am aligning with the X and the Z coordinate and then position over motion blocking. So what this means is that after the positioned over motion blocking, I have changed the position to the lower northeast corner of the first air block below the player. Then I use positioned and relative coordinates to change that to the middle of that air block. And finally, that is where I'm running the particle command for smoke. And if I activate this command, you can see what is going on here. Roughly below the player, always in the middle of the block, you have now a smoke ball. And this is a really retro looking way to have the player being trackable. Just a little playing around with positions, but I'm pretty sure this might be something interesting for a minigame. Or maybe a, well, invisible labyrinth or something like that based on commands. Third example is just a simple example for what you can do without a run subcommand. So here, execute if entity, and here I'm looking for chickens. So what happens is I'm basically counting how many chickens are currently loaded in the world. And if I do this, you can see there are currently apparently 5 chickens around. Now this number I could also use together with a store command to store it somewhere in a scoreboard objective or similar. But this is just a very simple example to show you this functionality. And the last example, I'm again running in a command block. And this might be a little bit more of a interesting part. Now what I'm doing here is I'm circumventing the limitation of the data command, that it can only run on a single entity. So let's have a look. I'm executing as all the armor stands within 5 meters around the command block in this case. I'm storing the result of the data following command in the entity self. So since I'm executing this as the armor stand, I'm storing that in each armor stand. And I'm storing the value as the rotation in the horizontal value. This is a float number and I'm not scaling it with anything but 1. And the command I get that value from is the data get command, and I'm extracting the horizontal rotation of the nearest player. Again, scaling factor is 1. So what this means is that all of those armor stands here are following my horizontal orientation with a slight delay due to the animation, but you can see I can place more of those and they will all immediately follow this pattern. I don't need to add another command for each of those, which I would have to do if I were just using the data command, because the data command is limited to just working on single entities. And with that, we've reached the end of this episode about the execute command. I hope you enjoyed it. I wish you a nice day and well, see you.